It's my pleasure to welcome you to this final performance in the series on the uses of leisure. This has been billed as a symposium, and since the word symposium has been used, I feel it quite necessary to begin by presenting certain specific disavowals. Symposium. Well, it's a word that's used in various ways. It has, in the first place, the connotations of a free-for-all. When people plan a symposium, they choose antagonists. You might typically expect that William Buckley, Arthur Schlesinger Jr., Robert Welch, and Malcolm X might appear, all on this table. And then, this would be the surprise, Governor Ross Barnett would come out and act as moderator, if you can imagine. That is not our purpose tonight. I don't expect to act as referee. Then, if you were coming to a symposium, you might expect to find experts on some subject, focusing on that subject, and I must, at the beginning, explain that these are not experts in leisure. Except, and they're murmuring now, I could predict that, except in the sense that each of our speakers tonight has, in a very, I think, curious way, managed to combine the ingredients of the life of work and the life of play, if those are not too crude terms to use, in a most meaningful way, so that none of our speakers tonight has any problem of leisure. Each of them speaks from some divine and sublime complacency about the whole question. Now, I think from what I've already said, and from what those of you who followed the series from the beginning will imagine and realize, you will realize that what you can anticipate tonight is a peculiarly personal expression of an opinion on the question really of the human condition in a modern age. Not really any analysis of the problem of leisure as it relates to the discussions of organizations, charitable or otherwise, government, pundits, professors, preachers, public relations directors, or any of that, or indeed even real estate developers who offer utopia on the installment plan. What you can anticipate tonight is simply the statement of three people and a fourth who seeks to act as moderator and, if necessary, referee on the question of the human condition, on the question of leisure today, which is to say that the speakers in the series so far have agreed that there is a valid question of leisure, a question which defies any rigid classification, any rigid definition, that leisure is a problem which goes as deep as philosophy, as high as the spirit, as broad and as limiting as life itself. And it's not surprising that each lecturer so far in this series has chosen this occasion in a series on the uses of leisure to present a very personal statement of his own on the human condition, so that what you can anticipate tonight, as you have in the series so far, inevitably, is a statement of a personal philosophy by people who speak to the question of leisure from three different angles of vision, a statement of personal philosophy concerning the passing scene. Now, in the series so far, and I wouldn't presume to summarize that whole series, in the series so far there have been specific agreements and specific disagreements. The speakers so far have agreed that industrialization, automatism, qualities like these have made available increasing amounts of time beyond mere work, time which for many people presents problems of boredom, problems of apathy, and so on. The speakers have agreed at the same time that the increase in free time, that is, time free of work, has not necessarily resulted in leisure at least in the constructive and traditional sense. And insofar as leisure is a problem, it is a problem which must be confronted personally, a problem which cannot be organized by governments or by charitable organizations or by groups of citizens themselves. Speakers so far have agreed that there must be greater participation in the quality of human life by individuals, and so on. Now, there have been specific disagreements. There have been disagreements as to whether leisure, that is, leisure in the sense of that time which is made free by automation, by improvements in public health and so on, is a good thing. There have been disagreements as to whether, in the face of this enlargement of time to be used in whatever manner, parents should participate in what McCall's magazine has called togetherness. There's been disagreement as to whether there is any rigid definition of status, the status of amateur on the one hand and professional on the other hand in the arts, or an interplay or a fuzzying of distinctions between amateur and professional in the arts under the conditions of mass leisure. There's been disagreement on the question of whether there should be a search for community, a community, for example, of the aged and the aging, on the one hand, or a reintegration of extended families, families of the aged, of various generations, and of people out through uncles and cousins and so on, under the conditions of the new leisure. There's been a disagreement on whether there should be an emphasis on the fruitful and constructive use of non-work time, or whether there should be an emphasis on simple recreation in the conditions of the new leisure. And there's been a question among the speakers whether there is a danger that fun morality, that is the pressure to make use of free time, is a good thing, or whether people should simply relax and enjoy themselves without any such pressure. Well, all of these and similar questions are those that confront us tonight. I have no way of knowing whether our speakers tonight will be involved in these or similar questions, because the word symposium, although it presupposes some kind of conflict among the people involved in it, the word symposium has not impressed itself on the speakers for tonight. Speakers are free to present their own personal statement about the question of leisure. I have no way of knowing whether they'll be at one another's throats tonight, and I will have to act as referee, or whether they will simply agree on the basics of leisure and fall out among small specifics concerning its particulars. This is to say that our speakers tonight will be approaching the general problem of leisure from three different points of view, three different angles of vision. The first of them, Professor Lynn White, who is a professor of history, a medievalist, a specialist in the history of technology, will be presumably approaching the question of leisure from the historical perspective. The second speaker, Dr. Evelyn Hooker, research associate in psychology, will be approaching this question as a psychologist, and will be approaching it as one who looks at leisure from the perspective of those who conceivably have been thrown off the track by enormous amounts of leisure time, off the track by affluence in modern society. Our third speaker, Dr. Robert Trotter, who is the chairman of the music department at UCLA, and who incidentally and not so incidentally is leaving UCLA after this semester to become the dean of the School of Music at the University of Oregon, will be approaching this problem as an aficionado of the arts, as one who is himself a musician and a chairman of a department of musicians, and looks at the question of leisure from the perspective of the fine arts. Well, this is the prospect for tonight, and our procedure for the evening will be simply this. Each of the speakers will talk for a very brief time, 10 or 15 minutes. Then we will have general discussion among the three speakers, and finally we will solicit questions from the audience directed hopefully to each of the speakers, and will hope to throw more light, I suppose, than heat on the question of leisure in modern society. So that for the evening, I present first Professor Robert Trotter of the Department of Music talking on leisure, subsequently Dr. Evelyn Hooker, and then Professor Lynn White. He would just as soon talk from the table, and presumably that's what we'll do tonight.
My first concern is with an attempt at a personal definition of leisure. I do this despite the fact that not more than 20 minutes ago, certain professors of history, who shall remain nameless, but who are sitting on my left, said that definitions like patriotism are the last refuge of the scoundrel.
This was quoting Dr. Johnson.
In trying to get at such a definition, I rush to two terms that have been a part of our heritage for a long time, that have been used in many contexts: work time and leisure time. These suggest an approach to a definition, but I find that I immediately have to start hedging and hemming, if not hawing, because work permeates life, pervades life so much that something must be wrong with this pair of terms, work time and leisure time. Moving to the next level in the search, I decided that work time is when you're doing something from outer necessity. I remember as a piano student that someone might say to me, "Goodness, you played that piece well, you must have put in a lot of work at it." And this really took me by surprise, because I had never thought of it in those terms. Because inner necessity was what had really been pushing me, in addition to the grade I had to get. So if I set up this dichotomy and try to work from it from now on, I do so because it has been, if not explicitly a part of my life so far, certainly implicit, that work time is when you're doing something from outer necessity. Leisure time is that time in which you are driven by inner necessity. Now, a livelihood and time to earn a livelihood is what we would ordinarily think of as work time. But taking this new dichotomy, there are two ways to experience earning a livelihood. At least this has been my experience. There seems to be that kind of work which you go to with the assumption that you're going to be quite indifferent to it, do the job, get it done, please the boss, maybe get a raise, but really not doing much more than just hating every bit of it. Waiting for 5 o'clock, and then using the time from 5 until the next cycle begins for a kind of recovery in play, in fun, and in sleep. Another way that seems to be possible for people to earn a livelihood is to be involved in some kind of work which has definite hours to it officially, and to bring to those hours a certain amount of inner necessity. You can't turn up a button and turn it on. It's the choice of work, it's the gift of temperament that you have by which this becomes possible. But this seems to be another way by which people do this, so that the boundaries between work and leisure begin to blur. Now, we are able to choose between these two ways in a real sense, though a limited one. I'm interested to note in these past few years, where in addition to my work at the university, where I've worked for a well-known local non-commercial FM station that shall remain nameless, and watching the people with whom I have worked there, I've seen something very interesting happen, and that is that a group of people who come together to work at something in which it is impossible to be indifferent. You either work at KPFK with dedication or not at all. And it's been a fascinating experience to me. I must say that the same thing takes place at the university in one degree or another. And that is that when you get people together whose jobs demand of them that they get some moral satisfaction, some aesthetic pleasure, some philosophical response, some kind of circuit closed between them and their work. When you get people together who depend on this, then the going's pretty rough. I like to think that people who make Kleenex or who box Kleenex get along wonderfully together. If we choose to set up our lives in such a way that earning our livelihood if we set up our lives in such a way that the time that we spend earning our livelihood does include some kind of inner necessity, then we have a further choice. Work and leisure have begun to blur. But when we're through with our specific job time, our livelihood time, then we can shift far away from it in order to recondition us. Don't forget, it's something that we love. And so we want to come to it with a kind of freshness, of a readiness to experience those good things which it offers us. Thus, to use the time in between job times as a time to recondition ourselves, to recuperate our powers, is one way to do this. Or, I think there are some people who use the time after job to pursue their work further. There are people whose inner necessity is so closely tied up with their job earnings, time, that they go home and do more of it without embarrassment, without limitation, without any outer necessity to do so, and find that this gives a kind of unity to their lives. I could have quoted Edgar Guest at this point, but
Keep right. Go ahead.
but I choose a poet, Robert Frost. You'll remember that Frost said of his poems that they begin in delight and end in wisdom. And one of the ones that I first learned in freshman English, Old English that was the Two Tramps in Mud Time, where the man who's out sawing wood, cutting logs, is accosted by two tramps who try to argue him out of doing the work because they need to do the work. He wants to do the work, and the wood has to be cut. The poem ends as follows: "Yield who will to their separation. My object in living is to unite my avocation and my vocation, as my two eyes make one in sight. Only where love and need are one, and the work is play for mortal stakes, is the deed ever really done for heaven and the future's sake." This is one way, and it leads people to a condition where their work and their leisure have fused. And this is a cursed blessing. So I define leisure as inner necessity with a whole wide range of active, passive possibilities. You can go out and lie under the breadfruit tree in Schlaraffenland, as the peasant did in the, I think it's a Bruegel picture that's for some reason impressed itself on me indelibly. Or you can go out and hew logs. Our problem with leisure is, first of all, to be conscious of what that inner necessity is, what those inner necessities are, so that we can nourish them and can derive nourishment from them in full measure, rather than just sort of muddling through. This is a plea for consciousness. Second, there are three words that have intrigued me. Two of them have become shabby. One of them is the word amateur, or in playing the etymological game with it, I take it over to amateur and try to put back into it its etymological roots of a lover of something. Someone who is an amateur is someone who does it because he loves it. As it stands now, amateur tends to connote the no good and to be an opposite to professional, which means good. So I argue that in working with the idea of leisure, that one of the things that we have to do is to recognize that an amateur is someone who does something for the love of it. The word dilettante equally has suffered. It has come to mean Helen Hokinson type ladies and men who fiddle with basket weaving or weave with fiddles, and it has lost its positive meaning of someone who takes delight in something. The word connoisseur has fortunately so far escaped this abuse insofar as I know, but it means someone who knows something, who understands it. In the French, the connoisseur, the amateur, is someone who understands something and who loves it. Interestingly enough, there is the German Liebhaber und Kenner, someone who loves something and who understands it. If we're thrust into professionalism, and we are, in the sense that we all have to earn a living, well, most of us, and if we're told when we have to perform and how we have to perform in order to achieve success, that is, promotion, tenure, then we can carry along some inner necessity as well. So that what happens is that we become lovers of our jobs, delighters in our jobs, understanders of our jobs. And in this way, leisure and work tend to blur. This is relatively easy for some. I count myself extremely lucky both in being involved in music and involved in teaching, because this just makes things a little easy for me. I'm a professional musician, I'm an amateur pianist, and I'm a connoisseur at listening, in thinking about music, in talking about it. Some don't have it so easy and have to turn away from their professional selves to their knower, understander, lover selves. And to do this wholeheartedly without any embarrassment is to make use of the resources of leisure. I'd like to conclude by taking this way out to the most dangerous, the most highly speculative level that I can. And that is to say that our fundamental responsibility, not just in order to have a good time, but our fundamental responsibility as human beings, is to search out the essential features of our inner nature and then find adequate vehicles by which we can express that nature and develop it. The arts, which are closest to me, offer resources for many people in this. It fulfills their sensuous, not sensual, sensuous appetites, their appetite for delight in the senses. It fulfills a need that I believe is part of many of us. We want to be challenged, but we want the challenge, sometimes at least, without competition. I think this is one of the big glories of a bridge game well played in a good spirit, or of sports. It is a place where you can safely challenge, compete without real danger. I say that the arts also offer resources for people because we need to be purged to have this catharsis of the pity and the terror that comes, the idea itself coming from the venerable Aristotelian tradition. We need that, but we want to be protected by the aesthetic distance. I've been fascinated in my reflecting on the experience of taking our children to watch Raisin in the Sun as staged centrally at Players Ring. It was one of the most powerful plays that I've ever experienced in central staging, and since it's my nature to be empathic in this way, I found myself relating to our children as they watched this thing, where this battle in the play was going on not more than 4 feet away, while she was frying an egg, a real egg, in the theater, and I found myself a bit terrified because the aesthetic distance had been chopped mightily away, like 3D comics and Cinerama, and Ray Bradbury's 4 walls of television that we have to look forward to. The aesthetic distance that protects us in the arts gives us a chance to be purged safely. Also, the arts offer a resource in that they allow us, in a more or less foggy way, to strive toward a kind of union between our intellects and our emotions, in the sense that a connoisseur not only opens himself up to the experience of the arts and to the emotional impact of them, but also in reflecting on them afterwards, reflecting on his aesthetic experience and in funding it for the future, tends to be involved intellectually in a way that I consider part of a definition of maturity. And last but not least, I think the arts offer a resource to us in that we recognize the power of aesthetic ecstasy, the way that it foreshadows or speaks of another kind of ecstasy, and that this is one of the things that the arts offer to us. So, for me, if we face our time away from earning a living in searching for this kind of vivid quality, rather than just fun, which I'm also ready to accept, the lying under the breadfruit tree also has its points. But if in general we work toward using leisure in this search for a vivid quality in our lives, rather than a mere for kicks, then we have faced the resources of leisure in a way worthy of praise. Thank you.
Now, if I did not make it clear in my introductory comments that these would be essentially 3 very personal statements of the question of leisure, Mr. Trotter's comments will have made that clear. And that being the case, I shall now turn the program over to Dr. Evelyn Hooker, Research Associate in Psychology, who will give her personal statement on this question. Sure. She chooses to stand up, and if any of you challenge her, be aware that she is standing.
She has to have a mic.
Yes, she does.
For the recorder backstage. They're recording backstage.
We need one for the recorder, you see?
I hope you'll indulge me that I think more easily when I stand than when I sit, and that's a limitation.
And that tells us a good deal about you.
And that leads me very easily into the first statement with which I was going to begin my remarks this evening, and they are not much more than remarks, and that was to say that anybody who has the courage to talk about the problem and the resource of leisure realizes that he's saying a very great deal about himself or herself. And this is indeed a gigantic projective device for saying something about me and Bob Trotter and Lynn White. I agree so very much with what Bob Trotter has just said about leisure as following of inner necessity, that it's very difficult for me to say the kinds of things that I had prepared before I knew at 6 o'clock this evening that he was going to say what he has just said. But let me say what I was going to say. I spend and have spent the last 9 years not teaching, but doing research with people who are not in and of the academic community. These are people whom one might call, if there is such a person, the average man. That is to say, these are people who live in the community and who cut across a wide occupational range and who live work lives and leisure lives of a very heterogeneous sort. And one of the things which I do is to try to discover something of what goes into the relation between the kind of work life one leads and the kind of leisure life one has. And it is out of that kind of background, and because I am a psychologist and not in the arts or the humanities, that I want you to hear the remarks which I want to make. I start with the assumption that leisure is not simply a recovery from work in order to return to work. That is, I start with the assumption that leisure is not the absence of work, but that rather leisure is either an attitude of mind and spirit or an activity in which the often partial and segmented character of what one does at work finds some kind of completion in the whole. The relation, therefore, between leisure and work is not, I think, the relation of opposites to each other. I do not see leisure as the opposite of work, but I see it as part of the pattern, the total pattern of life, of which work is one aspect. And the relation between leisure and work, it seems to me, can take a wide variety of forms. If I were to posit an attitude which is the opposite of work and which is the equivalent of leisure, I would say, and I don't know any word which can describe this, other than to say that it is the opposite of a sense of urgency and haste and anxiety. Let me try to say some things about that later on in the few minutes at the beginning of this. One of the problems, it seems to me, that all of us are caught in now is the sense that life suddenly has a sense of urgency, a sense of haste, a sense of anxiety, a sense of being driven in such a way that it is impossible within work or without work to contemplate or to realize the nature of the whole. Now, the relation between work and leisure, therefore, that is, leisure as an attitude or an activity which is related to the completion of life in addition to work. These forms are varied, and it seems to me that one of the most important aspects of work in relation to leisure is the meaningful character of work. It will already be apparent to you, I think, and let me anticipate my conclusions now. I do not see leisure as a time in which one is not working. I see leisure as an attitude which can be coexistent and an activity which can be coexistent with work. But that depends on the nature of work. Now let me say some things about the kinds of things which I see, the kinds of attitudes which I see, the kinds of feelings which I experience in relation to the world outside the academic walls in which I work. Most of the people whom I know, whom I work with as research subjects, are people for whom work is a means to an end. Work is not in itself a meaningful activity, but is a means to the end of escaping from what one is doing in order to live, in order to escape into some kind of excitement which gives a sense that one is alive. What I'm saying is essentially this, that in our society the problems of leisure cannot be viewed apart from the problems of the nature of work in our society. And let me try to say rather quickly what I see these problems to be. One of the first problems is that work is seen as the opposite of leisure, or leisure is seen as the polar opposite of work. And in our society, and this is true for me too, the use of time not to work with is full of guilt and anxiety. I am a scientist, a social scientist. I find that in order simply to keep up with the rapid proliferation of knowledge in my field, it's essential that I work 7 days a week straight round the clock. Now, when I say it's essential that I work 7 days a week straight round the clock, I mean that this is a problem, that the problem of being able to do the kind of work which I have to do as a scientist and to keep up with my field means that the amount of what would ordinarily be called leisure time simply does not exist. So this is the first problem, that when work in our society, in which most of us have at least residues of the Protestant ethic about the importance of work and the kind of problems about the use of leisure or laziness, that we feel guilty when we are not working, and that furthermore, the competitive nature of our society, as it is imposed on most of us, at least in the world in which I live, that these kinds of pressures make it extraordinarily difficult for us to use, to have, and to use free time. Secondly, that for the majority of people, and I'm speaking now, let me turn from the world in which I live and move with my colleagues who are scientists or social scientists. Let me turn now to the world of the people, the research people with whom I work. And that is that for them, leisure has no meaning. The opportunity for freedom from work obligations has no meaning because work itself has no meaning. That is to say, that work for a large majority of Americans essentially robs them of a sense of independence and autonomy and initiative, and that the feelings, therefore, of inadequacy are so pervasive that the use of any amount of free time in any constructive way is almost impossible. The third problem which arises in relation to the use of leisure time in relation to work is, it seems to me, that although there is an unparalleled possibility of the use of artistic forms, aesthetic forms, cultural forms by the large body politic, that in order to make good use of these opportunities, it is essential to be able to understand them. And to understand them means disciplined education. One of the problems in relation to this is that it seems to me that we are caught in the use of leisure either as fun or simply as an escape from ourselves. What I would designate, or what has been earlier designated as a fun morality or as an instrumental morality. I speak in a sense as a prophet of doom, don't I? And I speak as a prophet of doom because I am really appalled by the kinds of problems, not in relation to this kind of audience, or not in relation to an academic community, but in relation to the use of leisure and the use of work as I see it in the community. The fourth problem which I want to mention is that in our society, it seems to me, and I would describe it this way, and in a sense this is the use of a cliche, with its alienation from work as means to an end, not an end in itself, with its alienation from the community, and with its alienation from the person himself, that we have relatively few opportunities in our society to realize any kind of symbolic representation of ourselves and of the community as a whole. I was very much impressed about 3 years ago by an article which appeared in the Saturday Review of Literature by Henry Murray, who is a psychologist at Harvard, who spoke on the title, who wrote on the title, The Need for a Mythology, a New Mythology for Grown-ups. And what he was talking about was the fact that for many of us in our contemporary society, that those symbols of religion, of philosophy, of art, which symbolize to us the totality and the meaningfulness of existence, of the human society and our place in it, that these symbols no longer have meaning. Psychology, modern psychology, does not help us very much, because there are not many forms of modern psychology, and I say this as a psychologist, which give us an image of man, which enables us to think about man as an autonomous, self-actualizing, freely choosing, though within limits, kind of agent. The utilization of leisure within the kind of framework which Bob Trotter was talking about, that is the recognition of what one's inner necessities are, can only come from some kind of realization of oneself as having an area of choice and autonomy which cannot be denied, and within the realms of the the frames of discourse of modern psychology, there is very little room left for this. Let me end by reading this statement. Leisure as an attitude or activity in which the affirmation or indeed the celebration of the delight and mystery as well as the tragedy of the human adventure and its place in the cosmic order requires solitude and privacy as well as a genuine community. As a resource for enriching the life of the individual and society, it must be viewed against a contemporary background of conflicting cultural and psychological forces, many of which press toward emotionally and intellectually shallow and empty, other-directed root togetherness values. The cultivation of that attitude of mind and spirit in which disinterested, that is not for any purpose other than its own sake, enjoyment of art and nature, or the creative development of art forms or scientific knowledge for its own sake can occur is the essence of what I mean by leisure. It may occur as an integral part of work, and I suspect the best work is leisurely done. And may I say parenthetically, I hope so, because that's the only place I find it. It may occur apart from time-oriented, goal-oriented, responsibility-governed activity. Whether in one form or the other, leisure is an attitude which may or may not be expressed in activity, which directly or indirectly involves an appreciation of the particular as a form of appreciation of the whole.
Now, I take it that I've warned you sufficiently that what we are witnessing tonight are three highly personal statements from three different angles of vision of the question of leisure, not focusing on the problem of leisure, but rather diffusing on the question of leisure. Having heard Robert Trotter and Evelyn Hooker, we now turn to the statement of Professor Lynn White of the Department of History, my esteemed colleague, who comes to this from the angle of vision of a medievalist and a historian of technology. Professor White.
Ladies and gentlemen, I have been commanded to stand at this thing. I wanted to sit down there. After all, Bob Trotter...
Come back! Come back!
What?
Come on.
No, I've been commanded. My Führer has said. Anyway, Bob Trotter being an artist, caught the overtones. Evelyn Hooker being a scientist, a social scientist, got up on her hind legs and sat here. I feel that in a symposium on leisure, to stand is a violation of the artistic integrity of the occasion. May I get, slightly indecent? I think one always should. last week there was a man from Knopf through. They not only sell books, they try to get you to write books. And I've been having a flirtation with this company for some time, and it really goes very nicely because they send representatives around who take you to lunch, and they take you to very good restaurants, and they feed you, and they try to persuade you to do the book. Now, of course, if you say, yes, you will, they quit feeding you. And if you say, no, you won't, they quit feeding you. And so this goes on, and they know perfectly well what the academic attitude is, and we know that they know, and altogether, this is what supports the restaurants locally. Well, anyway, 10 days ago, the man from Knopf was through, and he's been trying to get me to do something. I'm not quite clear what it is on the Middle Ages. And I was being coy and flirtatious again, and we had a very good lunch. And as we were leaving, I said, "Thank you for your largesse." He said, "Lynn White, you may take your repose on your own largesse." Well, this is what I wish we were doing this evening. As I say, I think this is a perfectly.
You know, he's making this up.
I'm not. You know the man who said it to me. Anyway, Keith Berwick, when he introduced us, my colleague in American colonial history is a very sagacious fellow, and he pointed out to you that this was the perfect program because you had three people speaking on leisure who had not the slightest personal experience with it. And I think from what the first two have said, this is quite clear. Mr. Trotter is a musician, frantically playing the piano. Evelyn Hooker is a scientist, nay, a social scientist, who is trying to find out about the common man absolutely frantically. She is finding 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, she is finding out about the common man, and
I'll never do it again.
Anyway, all I have to love is the Middle Ages. All I can do is assure you that this is likewise a full-time job, and very much excited about it. Now,
You're making that up too.
The topic of the evening is leisure, a problem and a resource. Now, the nice thing about being an historian, as Keith knows, is that when you ask an historian, what do you think about something, he has an evasion tactic. He doesn't have to say what he thinks, he just tells you what happened. And this occupies a great deal of time. In fact, it's like Parkinson's law. He can make it fill any available time. But the essential thing I'd like to say is that until very recently, leisure has been neither a problem nor a resource. It never occurred to anyone that leisure was either a problem or a resource. It was just there if you had it, and if you didn't have it, it wasn't there. The people who had leisure were an infinitesimal proportion of the population, the upper crust who were endowed, so to speak, and they had leisure, and the rest of the people worked very, very hard from dawn to dusk, and they scarcely aspired to leisure. So, as I say, it was not a problem, and no one ever thought that it might be a resource. And I think that Keith would agree with me that this situation as regards leisure existed in the 19th century in the United States, even to the end of the 19th century. Mind you, in the colonial period, which is his particular fanaticism, it was...
Now you cut that out.
People were still working very hard to open up a continent and scalp the Indians and Christianize them and do other things. And so they didn't have... they were working rather hard. And so there wasn't much leisure. But the gentleman of leisure in the European traditional classic sense of the word gentleman of leisure existed in the United States, not merely before the Civil War, but after the Civil War, especially with the enormous growth of fortunes, the great increase of wealth, the growth. It was statistically a very tiny class, but it existed. And the people who had the leisure never thought of themselves either as problems or resources. They simply were. The gentleman of leisure in the later 19th century existed in his own estimation and in the estimation of his society to be a vehicle of culture. Now, mind you, there was not any very high intellectual content to this culture. Culture was confused a little bit with good manners. But also, he existed to be an object of general admiration. And you cannot understand the self-image of the gentleman of leisure in the late 19th century, in his top hat with his gold-headed cane. I have 2 gold-headed canes at home. I keep them as curiosities. I shall never be able to use them. You can't understand the self-image without realizing what this was. The gentleman of leisure regarded himself as a work of art, simply to be admired, and as a vehicle of culture. I once asked a very wise lady who had been a debutante in the late 1880s, I said, what happened to the gentleman of leisure in the United States? He's vanished. She said it was that man Roosevelt, Teddy, I mean. And you see, this was the situation. Teddy Roosevelt was a Roosevelt of Oyster Bay. He went to Harvard. He should have joined the best club on Fifth Avenue and spent his life going to parties and looking out the plate glass windows on the passing parade. But no, that man Roosevelt began preaching the strenuous life. He thought you had to pull your weight in the boat. You were no longer an object of art if you were a gentleman of leisure. You had to do something about it, and this was rather frightful. And this lady, who was very literate, told me, and I've never checked on this, Keith, this is a good PhD problem. She said that in the magazines of the early 20th century, in the Outlook, for example, edited by Lyman Abbott, and things like this, you will find a considerable discussion of the gentleman of leisure, and should he exist. Well, he didn't very long, thanks to Teddy. I myself can remember the evaporation of the lady of leisure during the First World War and slightly after it, and then, of course, the whole thing was mopped up in the Second World War. The lady of leisure lost her raison d'etre. She, too, vanished into oblivion. At the present time, even our frivolities have got to be conducted under the aegis of a good cause. I would commend to you the family section of the Los Angeles Times any day. The more asinine the party you want to give, the more solemn and eleemosynary and philanthropic has got to be the cause for which you give it. This is really a very curious situation that we've got ourselves wrapped up in at the present time. As I see it, in America today, we have unemployment, we have underemployment, and we have retirement, all of which produce or are supposed to produce boredom. I can hardly wait for my own retirement. There are so many things I want to do, but this is irrelevant. As I say, I know nothing about leisure. All of these words, unemployment, underemployment, and retirement, though, are words, you see, negative in relation to work. You don't do it anymore. And work is the positive word. We have, I think, and here I think it's almost treason to an audience when 2 members of a panel agree. But I really agree with Mrs. Hooker. We have no conception of leisure today in the classic affirmative, good sense of the word. We can't even talk about leisure in the classic sense because we have no conception what it is. Even our vacations are done on the excuse that they'll help us work better and more efficiently after we get home. Where is all of this leisure we hear about? Nobody I know, including the people on the platform, has any. Now, classic leisure. Of the 5th century, enormously wealthy. He lived in Gaul. he wrote endless letters. We have them endlessly. He really wrote them for posterity and not to the people to whom they were addressed. They're immensely elaborate letters, and he's so glad when he can get away from the cities where he, as a senator, has to wear the toga and be rather formal and, go to meetings and committee meetings and all this kind of stuff and rule what remains of the empire. The whole thing shot to pieces by that time, of course, but you can't let on that it's gone to pieces, of course. But he loves it when he can get off to one of his villas. He has several, to what he calls the tunicata quies, the sport shirt leisureliness, where you don't have to wear a stiff collar and things like that. It's a lovely life. In the morning, perhaps, he rides around the estate and kind of bosses the work. Of course, he has foremen to do it, but he goes through the pretense. But after lunch, he comes home to lunch, and there's really nothing to do after that, and so he maybe has a good bath and a nap, and he does some reading, and he writes letters. He writes these endless, very elaborate letters. Most extraordinary Latin. One exasperated translator has said that the Latinity of Apollonius Sidonius recalls to the wearied mind that creature of the sea which at will hides itself in a cloud of its own ink. I think he has some ancestors at the present time, but obviously Apollonius Sidonius was having this was leisure. He tells about sitting, listening to the flutes of the shepherds on the hills, listening to the honking of the swans on the lake before his villa in the evening, listening to the crickets after sunset. This is leisure. There's no compulsion. There's no inner necessity. He isn't doing anything. He's just enjoying it. He's just enjoying it. So this is leisure in the classical sense, and we haven't the faintest notion in our society. Not one of us sitting in this room has the faintest notion of a leisure which is free of what Mrs. Hooker so well called the guilt feelings which swaddle our leisure at the present time. What do we have now? We have, I think, a new phenomenon. We have an internal compulsion for which there is no name. We slap the classical word, the old word, leisure on, but it's so different from the old. It has no resemblance. What we now have has no resemblance to the old. This thing we call leisure is a complex thing which has grown up partly because the technological revolution has made some time available for optional activities, not simply work, by most people. It has grown up partly because this same revolution has affected communications in such a way as to broaden horizons and sympathies. We may sneer at TV, radio, all these other nasty things that our children waste their times on. Maybe we waste our times too sometimes. We sneer whenever we aren't looking. But I think we forget how enormously horizons have been expanded by these curious devices which have come in our own memory. I think that this unknown, which we falsely call leisure, and which we purport to be discussing here, is a combination of four elements. The first element is a very profound conviction that activity is good and that inactivity is bad. It is just about that simple. We scarcely analyze the values involved in the specific activity, but activity in itself is good. I will not elaborate. The second element in this curious entity, for which I have no name and I have no suggestion of a name, is a conviction that self-improvement is a moral duty, and that, why are you all here? That self-improvement is a moral duty, and that to accept yourself as you are is a form of total depravity. Again, I will not elaborate because you all know perfectly well in your own hearts what I'm talking about. The third element in this thing, this nameless thing, is an expanded social awareness which brings the conviction that each of us is responsible for the well-being, both physical and spiritual, of every other person. This is why when you have a silly hats ball, you have to do it for the paralytic children. This is the nexus, and it's a deeply moving nexus. I am not mocking. I'm recording. And the fourth element in this thing is an unprecedented cultural awareness which increasingly embraces the globe, and all the variant forms of the human race. These things have never existed before. These are novelties in our own age. This thing we call leisure, which is a compound of these four things, has no precedent in human history. No wonder we're assembled in Schoenberg to talk about something we don't know anything about, because there is no precedent for knowing anything about it. But it is very good that we are here to talk about it. Now, I myself, being an American, nay, a native Californian of the second half of the 20th century, I share these four convictions. I believe that activity is good. I cannot leave myself alone. I believe that I have, even though I try to evade it, a moral responsibility for all my fellow human beings. And also I am fascinated to the point of hypnosis by the spectacle of the new world that I see unfolding before me. A world I never made, but a world more marvelous than I could have made. I share all of these fixations, these convictions, these awarenesses, because I am an American and a Californian of this time. And all of this keeps life extraordinarily full. I am not a calamity whaler. Things have changed very fast. Many of us in our total population began to become aware before there were all these things to become aware of. We are at the present time, not merely through our schools, but through these damnable things called TV and radio and such like, we are actually at the present time educating our children far better than we realize in terms of these four elements in this mysterious entity on which we slap the word leisure. And if we can continue this process with enthusiasm, with zest, with amateurishness and connoisseurship, and a few of the other nice words, I think that there will be very little boredom in the lives of any of us as time goes on. Thank you.
Now, it should be perfectly clear to all of you that we can go on all night, and beyond that if necessary. But that's not part of our design. I think that at this time I will simply ask each of the previous speakers to comment, and assuming that we can extricate ourselves from that, we will then solicit questions from those of you who are still left, and this may go on, 11, 12, 1. Stay with us.
Don't let him alarm you.
I think I will first turn to Mrs. Hooker on my right, who may have some comment about the question of leisure in regard to its definition, the extent to which it is a problem or a resource. You see, I'm not really hedging my bet. I simply want to cover all possibilities.
Well, I would, first of all, I ought to say, could I have a few private words with the audience?
There you go.
The private words I'd like to have are these, that it was said before this began that as the woman, I was going to be the ham between two crusts, and you see quite clearly that that isn't so.
As you see, we are making personal statements tonight.
As you see, we all relish this, and we're all in a fine pickle.
Well, I'd like to say a couple of things about, I don't think the problem is it's obvious, I suppose, from what I said, that I really do agree very much more with Bob Trotter than I do with Lynn White. And I wished I agreed much more with Lynn White than I do. Now, I'd like to say a couple of things about these eloquent and charming and leisurely remarks. And I mean that in a very complimentary kind of way. It seems to me that the kind of grace and eloquence with which Professor White is able to speak in the way in which he's just done with you.
May I say she means done at you.
You know my heart's in the right place anyway. That this is a part of the aspect of leisure that it seems to me is rapidly being lost and is not being regained, in part because of the kind of sense of urgency and disquietude that we have. Now, I see problems, the leisure, as indeed a very real problem. That the problem of the definition of what leisure is, let me try to say in another way, something that I tried to say in my original remarks, in relation, I think, to what Professor Trotter was trying to say, and did say eloquently. And that is that because of the kinds of pressure of a technological civilization for most of us, I think we're in the stage of seeing a much more rapid class division, and I expect to be challenged on this immediately, so let me say it quickly while I have this mind. A much more rapid class division in terms of those who are going to have work which is very meaningful to them and who are going to spend much more time in that meaningful work, as distinguished from those who are going to be engaged in doing work which is not highly meaningful, who are going to have much more time on their hands, and therefore for whom the question of who they are and what their identities are and what they're going to do, not only with this meaningless time which they spend at work, but with the time in which they're not occupied, this is going to become a severe crisis. Let me quote, for example, Al Hibbs, from the distinguished scientist from the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, who envisions 50 years from now, that was 5 years ago, when he said that our greatest problem in the future is going to be that we're going to have a technological elite of people whose highly developed skills and intelligence, trained capacities, are going to be increasingly used over time, and we're going to have a very large population of persons whose skills and capacities and talents do not allow them, do not permit them to be of use in this technological age, and therefore the problem, the utilization of time, is going to be a very important problem. Now, what I see as the problem, therefore, is a conception of the nature of man in relation to leisure. I don't see how we can define the problem of leisure, the nature of leisure, until we have some notion about what we're like as human beings, until we're able to conceive of ourselves not as robots, not as persons to be pushed around, but as persons who are total human beings. I'll leave it at that. I'll talk to you.
I just sent a note over to Lynn White asking him if he would wish to comment on this. His comment to me in writing was that he had already commented on this, and so I now turn to Bob Trotter, who may have something to say.
No.
Okay, may I?
Yes.
Yeah.
You see, that was all part of the design.
No, this is. I hate to be unworried. You know, it's a sign of moral perversity in the 20th century if you're not worried. It proves insensitivity. At the present time, our great employment problem is with the undereducated, the people who had very little education, who dropped out of school much too early, who had inadequate education when they were in school. It is here, and not in the people who had an education beyond the 6th grade, that one finds the employment problem. This is a part of the tragic legacy of 300 years of slavery, which has debased both the black and the white schools of the southern part of the United States, and has made the situation so difficult in areas to which the surplus population of the South has been emigrating because of the agricultural revolution in the South. It seems to me that this fact that unemployment is not a matter of the technological elite, or even of the people of moderate education, or even of the people who are barely literate, that is, who can fill out an application blank. The problem is not here. It's at the lower levels. As we raise the levels of general education, which means general capacity for perception in our society, I believe that we are going to solve the problem of leisure, which is a frightful problem at the present transitional stage. The world is moving extraordinarily fast. Different parts of the world are moving at extraordinarily different paces. Different parts of the United States are moving at extraordinarily different paces. But I believe that the problem of leisure is essentially a matter of raising the general level of perceptiveness, which means education in the broadest sense, to the point where people can take care of themselves without having any paternalistic group tell them, now you're having leisure, do this. This is what I dread.
I think at this point, without our chattering on and on, I would like to turn to questions from the audience. I continue to believe, as I have since the first evening of this series, that the only problem of leisure is to awaken the qualities of life and thought to such an extent that there will be no problem of leisure, and I persist in thinking that that is really what my colleagues here on the platform tonight believe also. But having said that, I will now turn to whatever questions you might wish to ask. I would ask you simply to stand and to address your question to whichever member of this panel you would wish to, and I will recognize that member, this man in the back. She's now rolling her eyes.
Yes, I do. I'd like to add to that. It's perfectly apparent, I think, to all of us that human nature is conditioned by the kind of cultural milieu in which the individual or in which the human group grows and develops, so that it's possible to move from the Stone Age to the 20th century in a relatively short period of time, if Margaret Mead's evidence is correct. All of that is true. Nevertheless, it seems to me that it is also true that that there are certain needs fundamental kinds of human needs which cut across culture. And it seems to me that one of the greatest, I'm in peril now of my scientific reputation, but that doesn't mean very much, so let me go ahead. That one of the greatest problems of our ability today to think about problems of the sort which we're talking about here tonight is the problem of cultural relativism. That is the assumption that morality, that human needs are dependent on particular cultural milieu in which those persons are found. And I do not believe that that is so. Let me say, but just add one statement to that. I think it is true, for example, that irrespective of the kind of cultural conditioning in which men find themselves, that destructiveness, war, for instance, highly aggressive, destructive needs are essentially a manifestation of human behavior which irrespective of the culture in which it occurs, is destructive. I think we can say that much. I think we can say that all we know about the nature of human nature, irrespective of its manifestations across cultures, indicates that the needs of people to form genuine human communities with mutual trust of each other, that this is a genuine human need, and that wherever you find people, that you find this manifestation at some level. That's what I meant by saying we need to know something more about the nature of human nature than we know now. We need to think about what I really meant by that, and let me say it this way. This is really you may have thought we were joking. You may have thought your chairman was joking when he said that tonight each person who spoke was really going to speak personally. I was not joking. For me, this is a very deadly serious matter. The question of the capacity to look at human life, myself, human society, the direction in which human society is moving, without urgency, without haste, without being able to demand that we move quickly. This is a life and death matter for the work I do. And it seems to me it's a life and death matter also for the society in which we move. And that is the essence of the attitude of leisure. That is the sense in which Spinoza used it, that we live under the sense of eternity. Well, this is part of what I mean by saying that we need to know something more about, we need to have much more of a conception of the capacities for autonomy and choice and freedom of the human being in order to know what kinds of capacities we can develop in terms of his use of that kind of attitude in work and in non-obligated time.
Shall we talk in unison? May I ask, I think any of us might wish to speak to this. May I ask Mr. Trotter to speak to it?
Would you repeat the question, Mr. Chairman? I'm sorry, I must confess that your question had for me so many different aspects that I find myself trapped at the moment into silence. In other words, if I can hear the question rephrased in such a way that it makes sense to me personally, forgive me for saying it in that derogatory sense. I don't mean it that way. I can only say that this is so self-evident that perhaps that's why I had difficulty at first in answering it. But I can elaborate and again try to make it personal in saying that in seeking to understand others, I am inevitably brought back to myself, not from an excessive appetite for self-study, but just in order to make sense out of this, in order to make sense out of what other people are, I find that I have to examine myself in relation to them. I'm an amateur at this. And I think perhaps part of what you're saying is that the study of anthropology, the study of sociology, the reading of Margaret Mead, and so on, is a good way to spend one's free hours. If by doing so we are made aware of those aspects of human nature that are elastic, I think that Dr. Hooker's rebellion at the idea that everything is culturally relative is not so strongly held by her that she wouldn't admit that there are certain things which are relative that do make us more elastic by recognizing the differences in attitudes among different cultures. And I would say that this certainly is a fruitful way to spend our leisure. But another way to do this, if we wish to use the arts in that way, is through experiencing the arts. So that's as much sense as I can make in an answer.
You see that Mrs. Hooker nods her head, which will stand for any comment. You see also that we could go on all night. We don't intend to do so, but we will take a few more questions.
Dr. Berwick, since these are being recorded, I presume they're going to be typed up. Will any copies be available?
A highly practical question. Will these comments and those that have preceded them be made available, since they are all being recorded? I don't know. All the lectures have been recorded, and there is the chance that the whole series in revised form will be published. If you're interested in this, I would simply ask that you address a card or a letter to the Department of Public Lectures at UCLA expressing your interest. This will act also, first to indicate your interest, and second, conceivably to spur this development?
Address them to the editor of the publication, Professor Berwick.
Of course. Yes, sir.
I greatly enjoy the leisure of publishers' luncheons. I also enjoy the life and the kind of study which leads them to want me to do this kind of thing. However, I'm so busy enjoying that I can't write the books that they want me to write, you see. So leisure becomes self-defeating, but in a very happy way.
And do you know what they always say at UCLA? Publish or perish. I don't think that will happen to Lynn White. Sir?
In order for me not to become a subject of Dr. Hooker, I'll ask just one question that I did ask once of Dr. Berwick. And that is, look at the white things around here. We are not enjoying the leisure. We are made to take leisure. We did not have the advantages that the young people are getting today. And the question is what to do with our time.
This is, of course, a question for Mrs. Hooker, who will, I hope, restate it.
Oh, dear God. I don't think I can answer that question. I think I can say a few things about it. I'm now seeing people who, in the midst of the kind of affluence, of the kind of cultural opportunities which Professor White has talked about, are using these in such a way. These are not college students, these are people out in the community, who anywhere between 25 and 40 are now using their time, free time and work time, in such a way that when they get to be at whatever distinguished age you are, sir, I'm sure that what they're going to be doing is asking the question you're asking. Now, the question this gentleman asked is the question, look at my evidence of distinction, of age. Tell me what to do with my enforced leisure. With my enforced leisure. I can't tell you what to do with your enforced leisure. That, to me, is one of the tragedies of our time. I think we're gradually evolving answers to your question, sir. I think that this is, as Professor White has said, that the problem of the enforced leisure of retirement with indefinite, almost indefinite expectation now of good health beyond the years of work. This is a new problem for civilization. We haven't known how to cope with this problem. Now the answer to your isn't, I beg your pardon?
I can answer as far as I'm concerned.
Yes. And your answer is?
I spend all my time with people of 65 and over.
Yes.
And in many of instances, they come to me and tell me their troubles that they wouldn't tell a social worker.
Yes. It's a very useful way. It's a very good solution. I know many people your age who found exactly that solution to help other people their age. But this is, in general answer to your question, it seems to me that this is one of the questions which, as Professor White referred to, which we're now gradually, we're going to have to evolve a lot of new answers for this question. And one of the answers to that question is, I think, to begin in terms of we haven't said a thing tonight, any of us in this panel, about the fact that leisure, its use, its definition, its usefulness as a resource and a problem, depends upon that stage of the life cycle in which one is. Leisure for a 20-year-old or a 25-year-old is very different from leisure for a 70-year-old or a 90-year-old. And I think we've got to begin to think in terms of the appropriateness of the stage of the life cycle at which the kinds of education and disciplined education for the use of leisure can begin.
I hate to be skeptical about organization, but I do not think that our problems show many present signs of being solved in these ways. Now, mind you, I think that the television industry, the movie industry, things like this, which are very incorporated, shall we say, I think these are making far greater contributions to the broadening of our intellectual interests and horizons than most of us are willing to admit. Nevertheless, in the long run, it is each one of us who has to arrive at his own solutions for these problems. I believe that I am frankly a little skeptical about what Mrs. Hooker has said about a unitary human nature. I never see any human nature. All I see is enormously diversified people. And I think we have to arrive at enormously diversified, highly individuated solutions for this problem of leisure at each stage of life. The Chinese, I cannot speak of the present China, but the old China, which after all was around for several millennia, insisted that each individual change his name about 5 times in the course of his life. You had a baby name, and then you had a boyhood name. I don't know about girls. And then you had a young man name, and you had a mature name, and you had an old name, and finally an honorific, should you live that long. And these different names indicated that you were in different stages of life. You were, in a sense, different personalities in each stage. This is a kind of wisdom which I think I would agree completely. This is almost the only point where I agree with Mrs. Hooker. But I would agree completely that we must absorb this, and each of us must save his own soul.
Mr. Trotter has a comment to add to that postscript.
Just that the idea that as we grow older, we might look into the possibilities of exploring new areas that have been around us, that have intrigued us, but for which we have had no leisure. This brings up the problem that as we grow older, we tend to care. There's the danger that we will care less and less about anything through a kind of corrosion, through a kind of attrition, to the place that when we are in that stage of life where we should be explorers, there's so little appetite left that we have only the, to quote Mr. Eliot, the cold friction of expiring sense. And this was my cheerful comment.
Dr. Hooker, you mentioned the Harvard psychologist who talking about the symbolism of centuries past having lost a great deal of significance today. And I think that this was the symbolism which has been used frequently to describe the human nature and the human living, human life. Would you care to comment as to why this loss of significance might be true? Why that was happening?
Well, I think the point which I was referring to was essentially the article I was referring to was an article by Professor Murray who talked about the fact that the great bodies of religious literature, for example, which have served in the past to interpret man to himself, his condition, his place in the universe, his meaning, that for many contemporary men, these no longer serve. The language is not meaningful. And that what we need is to develop a new body of literature, perhaps culled from the best of the past, all the best of the past, but couched in modern form, which will help us to find in the form of the arts, literature, architecture, the graphic arts, painting, which will help us somehow to symbolically understand our relation. Now, I think that if you ask me, why do I think that this is so? I would answer that only fragmentarily, and I think I ought not to be the one to answer this question. I think that our two distinguished colleagues really ought to answer this question. They're the historians and the people who know about human tradition. I don't. I would answer this in one sense, saying, in one way, by saying that it seems to me that when you live in an age in which the horizons of science have expanded in the way in which they have since the atomic bomb, that there virtually are no symbols which will help to capture the imagination of the universe as a whole and man's place in it. And that we're struggling very hard to find painters, writers, other people who will find music which will express for us this stage of terrible torment and anguish, and at the same time some positive affirmation of where we are. And we don't know yet. And I think that's, I think this is a very partial, fragmentary, kind of literate answer to your question.
If you will forgive me, I think that this is an appropriate note, a note of challenge, on which to close this evening's performance and this series on the uses of leisure. For those of you who feel some discontent, I would only point out that on this Thursday evening, Abraham Heschel, professor of mysticism and Jewish logic of the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York, will be performing in the context of another series, the series on the vital centers, at Moore Hall at 8 p.m. this Thursday evening. So that if there are questions, as I hope there are, which carry over from this series and this evening on the uses of leisure, I hope that you will carry them over to Thursday evening to hear Mr. Heschel. Meanwhile, I wish to thank all of you who are here tonight and all of those who are on the platform tonight for appearing in this series and for joining with us in these considerations of the problem of leisure in modern society. Thank you so much.